सेव किया था ना?
मैं सिर्फ इसलिए गया था क्योंकि उसने मुझे कॉल किया, that's it. But listen तो.
Save it for someone else.
जिंदगी में सेव करना जरूरी है, मगर जब बात पैसों की हो, सिर्फ सेविंग से काम नहीं चलेगा। इक्विटी म्यूचुअल फंड्स में इन्वेस्ट कीजिए और अपने सेविंग्स को आगे बढ़ने का मौका दीजिए।
Mutual fund investments are subject to market risks. Read all scheme-related documents carefully.
On this episode of Macro Sutra, we have a lot of data to discuss with you. There's been a lot that has been released by the government. On Feb 28th, they released the GDP growth rate for Q3 of this financial year, the second advanced estimates for the full year 2022-23. They revised growth rates for 2019-20, 2020-21 and 21-22. Now, we are going to look at the pandemic year and the post-pandemic year. So, that's what we have in this episode for you. How has India's economy done during the pandemic and in the post-pandemic period? I'm TCA Sharad Raghavan, Economy Editor at ThePrint, and we have with us Radhika Pandey, Senior Fellow at NIPFP. Thank you so much, Radhika, for joining us.
Thank you, Sharad.
So now, Radhika, since we have so much to discuss, let's dive right in. Looking at the pandemic year revision, 2019-20, now I know that they have revised it a few times before, and each time they've revised it higher. And this time around as well, they revised the growth for the year higher. So how are they doing this? Why are they doing this? What is the new data that they're incorporating?
So every time the GDP cycle has 5 set of revisions. Whenever a GDP number for the full year comes, there are 5 such data points that come out. One is the first advance estimate, then we have the second advance estimate, then we have the provisional estimate when the entire year is over, then during the month of May we have the provisional estimate, then the next year we have the first revised estimate, the next successive year we have second revised estimate, and then we have third revised estimate. So this is the complete revision cycle that we have for any GDP estimate that comes for the full year. So on 28th of February we had the NSO released the third revised estimate, which is the final number for 2019-20, and then for 2020-21, which is the pandemic impacted year, the second revised estimate, 21-22 the first revised estimate, and for 22-23 we had the second advance estimate. We did talk about the first advance estimate, which is like the first estimation about the 2022-23 number that came out in the month of January. So now it's not that the full year is over yet, but for the advance estimate, some kind of projections are done based on the data which is available for say 9 months or 10 months. For first advance estimate, we have the NSO has data for 9 months, and then some extrapolation projection is done. For second advance estimate, we have 1 more month, so we have 10 months of data, and then some projections are done. Now, what is the relevance of these revised estimates, particularly the pandemic impacted year, is that when we move from advanced to revised estimates, we have a wider coverage of data, because during the advanced estimates, we are only looking at monthly proxies, we are looking at IIP, we are looking at listed companies' performance. But when there is a big time lag and we move to revised estimates, we have a wider coverage. For example, we have the data from the annual survey of industries, which is the actual data on production for a wider set of companies, also including the informal sector. Then we have the actual data on revenue and expenditures, because in the provisional and in the advanced estimates, these are all estimates, but like we talk about budget estimates, revised estimates, but when we are talking in terms of revised estimates for GDP, we have a wider coverage. So that's the difference as we move from advanced to provisional to revised set of estimates. The coverage of data improves. We are able to have some measure of understanding of how the informal sector is being captured, the unlisted companies are being captured, the agriculture sector, the actual data of a wider set of the corporate sector is being captured in the revised estimates.
So now what exactly does this then mean for the pandemic year if after incorporating the informal sector data and getting more accurate data for the
Right.
year,
Yes.
if it's showing that growth was actually higher,
Yes.
that means that the pandemic didn't actually and the lockdown didn't actually impact us that badly?
Yeah, that's the inference from the second revised estimate, because as you see, as we, if we compare provisional estimate, then first revised and second revised, now we have the second revised estimate, the pace of contraction has narrowed.
Right.
We started from somewhere around 7.8% contraction, we moved to 6.6, and now according to the second revised estimate, the contraction is milder, which is 5.8. So it is still contraction, it is degrowth, but the pace of contraction is smaller. So the inference, the key message here is that when we include a wider set of coverage of data, the pace of contraction doesn't look that bad as earlier envisaged. So that's the key message for the 2021 numbers.
Right. And now when we talk about growth rates, it's measured against the previous year. So if
Right.
you say that 2021-22 growth rate was so many percent, that's so many percent growth over the previous year. So now does it mean that because the 2020-21 data, the revision moved it a little higher, does it mean that the next year's growth rate was also impacted, but they increased it for that year as well?
Yes, so for 21-22 also, which is the first revised estimate for this year, now as you rightly pointed out, we compare with the previous year.
Right.
And now for 2020-21, since the pace of contraction is lower, that means the base is higher.
Yes.
So that means if other things remaining constant, our growth rate would have been smaller.
In 21-22.
In 21-22, because your 2020-21 base is higher. So it's giving an unfavorable impact on the growth of 2021-22.
Right.
But the fact is that in 21-22 also there were revisions after incorporating the data as we move from provisional to revised estimate. So there also we see an upward revision from 8.7% to 9.1%. So till now we have been talking about 21-22 as having a growth of 8.7%.
Right.
But the bigger change happens when we move from provisional to revised estimates, because we have a much wider set of data. Whenever we compare these set of revisions, first advance and second advance estimate and provisional, we see that the larger quantum of change happens when we move from provisional estimates to revised estimates. So that was expected, that either we will see a downward revision or upward revision, but we did see an upward revision from 8.7 to 9.1, again indicating that when we take into account the wider set of data as envisaged, that we'll have a slower growth. It was not the case, notwithstanding the fact that you have an unfavorable base of 2020-21.
Right. So just to for those who are a little confused when we say base, high base, low base, all of that. So just to put it in a short way, a high base kind of means that the next year's growth will likely, if everything else remains equal, the next year's growth will be lower, and a lower base kind of enables higher growth the next year. A simple way to kind of look at this is if you compare India's economy with, say, something like the US. Now, if the US economy grows by 2%, and the Indian economy grows by something like 7%, it might be that 2% on the US economy is still in absolute terms a larger amount than the 7% on the Indian economy, but that's because the US economy is a very large base, whereas the Indian economy in relation is a smaller base. So that's how the growth and the base, that's how the relation works.
Yeah, another small example is when we compare April to June 2020, which was a lockdown year where it was a contraction.
Right.
And then you compare it with April to June 2021. Now, April to June 2020 had a contraction, so that will kind of bump up your growth for April to June 2021.
Right.
So that is the implications of base year, and it always comes into play when we look at the year-on-year change.
Right. And so now this also means not only did we do better during the pandemic than we thought, but even our recovery in the next year was stronger than we thought, because even though the base was increased, the next year's growth was revised upwards in any case.
Yes. So exactly, despite having a higher base, the 2021-22 we saw recovery, and the recovery was much sharper. That is what the revised data tells us.
Now, do we have some breakup on which sectors have been particularly revised upwards, which we thought didn't do that well but seem to have done better?
So it's primarily from the spending side, it's the consumption and investment that have not done that badly, and therefore there has been some revisions. So if we look at this time's press release, it has all set of statements for each year, as well as they have given given the breakup of consumption, that within consumption how much has been the spending on health, how much has been the spending on education. So it's a very rich set of data that we see in this set of press release.
We actually can, we'll display the link of the press release in this video. You should go through it. There's a lot of data there, and it tells you how the economy, how each sector has been doing, how things like government spending, private sector spending, consumption expenditure, how all of that has been changing during the pandemic and since the pandemic. We'll share this link. You should go through it. Now, coming to our current year, we have the second advance estimates for this year. So, how have these second advance estimates, how is it different from the first advance estimates which just came out in January?
Yeah, so again, if we just look in terms of growth rate, both are showing a growth rate of 7%. Like in first advance estimate also, the GDP growth for the current financial year was pegged at 7%. With the second advance estimate, which has one additional month of data, again we are seeing that for this year the economy will grow, is estimated to grow, because till now the financial year is not yet over. We have data till January, and based on that these projections and extrapolations are made.
That's why they're called advanced estimates.
That's why they are called
advanced
estimates.
It's in advance of the full year ending.
Yes, that's why they are called advanced estimate, and therefore once the financial year ends in March, then whatever you get as first thing, that is called the provisional estimate. So now we have the second advance estimate for 2022-23, which is also giving us a 7% growth. But there are two key differences here. One difference is in terms of the absolute numbers. The absolute number, what is the difference between first advance estimate and second advance estimate? The second advance estimate is almost 1.4% higher than the first advance estimate. Okay, so it's if we just look at the growth rate, we assume that everything is same, but that is not the case. First thing is that the absolute number of GDP has arrived from the first advance estimate and from the second advance estimate. There is a difference of 1.4%.
But the growth rate might not have changed because the base the previous year might have been revised upwards.
Yes, the base has been revised upwards, because for the first advance estimate, what is our base? The base is the provisional estimate of 21-22. But now we have the base as the revised estimate of 21-22. And again, there is a change from 8.7 to 9.1 there also. So despite having a higher base, again we are getting 7% growth rate. So it's not the same as getting 7% growth rate with the first advance estimate. Because now we are having we have achieved this, we are estimated to achieve this 7% growth rate on a higher base of 2021-22.
Right, and now again, we aren't done yet in how much data that they released on Feb 28th. We have data for Q3 of the current financial year, which means that is from the October to December 2022 period. We have data for that quarter, how we've done. And so Radhika, if you could tell us a little more about that.
So remember that for the first half of the year, the economy grew at 9.7%, and for the full year, the estimate is 7%. So it was understood that in the second half of the year, the economy will slow down. And if we look at the estimates that were people had projected for the third quarter, that is the December quarter, the growth estimates were in the range of 4.6, 4.7, maximum 5% growth. and the economy, the GDP growth stood at 4.4%. Now, again, one thing is the unfavorable base, because October-December of 2021 was a very strong growth year after having slowed down growth in 21-22 due to the third wave of COVID. So we saw growth declining, but October-December quarter we saw growth of more than 5%. 5.4%
yes.
without revision.
Without
before
the
revision.
Yes.
We saw a higher growth. So it was expected that the growth rate in terms of year on year will slow down in October, December, and it further slowed down because that number was also revised upwards.
Right.
Because now when your annual number is revised for the entire 21-22, we have moved from provisional estimate to revised estimate.
Right.
The quarter numbers will also get revised.
Of course.
Yes.
Do we know how much it was revised to from 5.4?
So, if we just want to capture the impact of revision, so if we consider the same number without revision, growth would have been 5.1% for this.
I see.
And the growth is 4.4%. So that is actually can be attributed to the extent of revision. That had there been no revision in the third quarter of last year, this quarter we would have got a growth of more than 5%, 5.1%. But it is a combination of two factors. One, an already high base year, an already high base, and then further the upward revisions because your entire year's growth was also revised. So that is the number for 4.4. And interestingly, this time the gross value added is more than the GDP.
Oh.
So gross value added is 4.6% and the gross domestic product is 4.4%. Now the difference between the two is the net taxes. So in GDP we include taxes but we exclude subsidies, whereas in GVA, gross value added, which is it gives a picture of economic activity, we include subsidies. So in this time, this quarter, December quarter, the subsidy outgo was large. We've discussed in the one of the episodes also, we've talked about the demand for grants where food subsidy, money was sought for subsidy. So in this quarter, the subsidy has been more than the taxes and therefore GVA is more than the GDP. So that's another interesting feature about this quarter's numbers. Now, next thing we can talk about is the sectoral composition.
Absolutely, exactly. I was coming to that. There's it showed that manufacturing has contracted for the second quarter consecutively. Now, it's a smaller contraction than in the previous quarter, but it's still a worrying sign.
It is still a worrying sign because manufacturing has seen a contraction, though the pace of contraction is lower. But if we look at the underlying numbers, you know, when we talk about manufacturing sector GVA, gross value added, we are talking about the performance of manufacturing companies. We can look at a better understanding can be had by looking at the profitability of these companies, the manufacturing companies, the sales growth of these companies, and in both these numbers we are seeing a slowdown. Sales growth has contracted, profitability has turned negative, and one of the main reason for that is that the expenses of firms have been rising, and one of the key expense that has suddenly shot up is the interest expense. Because of the RBI's 250 basis points rate hike, we are seeing that the interest expenses of firms in the manufacturing sector, they have seen a massive jump of 40% year-on-year growth. Remember 2020, 21 and 21-22 interest rates were lowered. They were kept low, so the interest expenses were quite subdued. But over the last 2 quarters, we have seen that interest expenses as a share of the overall profits of these companies have risen quite substantially, and that is getting reflected in the squeezing profit margins of manufacturing set of firms. And that is a sign of worry because manufacturing is a major employment generator. And if we look at a disaggregated picture, we find that some of the sectors which are labor intensive, like textiles, leather, they are not performing well consistently. So it's a combination of a number of factors: monetary tightening, slowing global demand, input cost pressures, inflation. But yes, overall we are seeing that manufacturing continues to be a pain point.
Right.
The only solace is that we are now seeing a slide in wholesale price index.
Yes.
Yes, so wholesale price index, we discussed in one of the episodes that WPI has become lower than the retail prices. So we can hope that that will trickle down to consumer price indices in the next few months if the other headwinds do not disrupt the calculations, and therefore manufacturing sector will get some support.
So if manufacturing is in contraction, what is doing well? What is driving this? Because as you said, the quarter's growth was on a high base,
Yeah.
and it's still come at 4.4. So something must be driving the growth.
Yes, what is driving is within the industry, manufacturing is not doing well, but the other sectors like construction has done very well.
Right, yes.
It has posted a growth of more than 8%, and that can be attributed to government's push on infrastructure, can be attributed to decent demand for housing. So that is one sector. Agriculture has done well, 3.7% growth. Services have been doing well, particularly the contact intensive services, again posting almost 10% growth, though the gain is slightly lower, the growth is slightly lower than the previous quarter, but it's still the main driver of growth from the activity side. Now, similarly, we should look at the spending side or the expenditure side, where we look at consumption, investment, net exports, and government spending. There, again, investment has been holding up well again, but what is apparently a cause of concern is the consumption. The consumption of households, and that is something which will need to be seen over the next few months and quarters as well, because again, in year-on-year terms, we have seen a sharp decline to 2.1%, the private final consumption expenditure. But again, as we saw, it is driven by a very strong base. October, December of 2021 had very high consumption levels if we look at the data. Also remember that this is a festival quarter, so we do see a seasonal induced increase in consumption also, as well as pent up demand during the last year. So on year basis, because you had a very high base, so we are getting a 2.1% growth. But if we just compare this quarter with the previous quarter, not the corresponding quarter of last year, but the September quarter, and compare with the December quarter, there's actually a growth of 7.8%. So these, there are various ways of looking at the data, and it's year on year can sometimes give us misleading picture. So it's always better to look at both year on year as well as quarter on quarter, where we compare this quarter with the previous quarter. Again, another concerning point is the government consumption, which is government final consumption expenditure, which has seen again second consecutive quarter of contraction.
Right.
That is mainly because government has been squeezing its revenue expenditure. So revenue expenditures are squeezing, and that is what is getting reflected in again, but the pace of contraction is lower as compared to the previous quarter, because revenue expenditures net of interest payments have seen a increase, but still overall there is a contraction. So on the expenditure side, what is doing well is investments. That is a key point.
So then that plays into the way that the government has been doing things. They have been pushing for capital expenditure and asset creating investments, but at the same time they've committed to a fiscal deficit target that is lower. So at some point they have to control their expenditure, and that seems to be happening on the revenue expenditure side.
Yes.
So there you have it. Now, a lot of the previous year's data, the pandemic year, the post-pandemic year of 21-22, that data seems to be showing us some good news, that our economy didn't do as badly during the pandemic, and it bounced back from the pandemic stronger than we initially thought. But the latest data that we have for the current year is showing that there are still severe headwinds that we are facing. The manufacturing sector, especially labor-intensive sectors, are struggling. They're in contraction, and we could be seeing the fact that all of these rate hikes by the RBI now are finally having an effect on the economy, and so companies are facing the brunt in terms of higher interest costs. So, that curtails that curtails their total money that they have to spend elsewhere. So these are things to look out for. But overall, Radhika, it looks like our economy is doing pretty decently.
Yes, it's doing pretty decently. Growth is evolving the way it should. We have surpassed the pre-pandemic level, and therefore that is something which the monetary policy now the next review meeting will look at, because remember in the last meeting there were dissenting voices from some of the members.
Right.
Two members, external members, who said that growth is faltering and hence we should stop pausing. We should pause on interest rate hikes and focus more on growth. So those will get some comfort, because overall growth for 2020, 21, 22 and even 22, 23 we are getting a 7% growth, which is decent. And even if, again, second advance estimates is again an assumption, but even if there are some changes, we should be getting at least a 6.7 or 6.8% growth for 2022-23, which is a decent growth, and therefore this will lead the RBI to retain its focus on inflation.
Right. So there you have it. That's what we have for you. Our economy during the pandemic did better than we thought. Our recovery was stronger than we thought. There are still some concerns, but policymakers are aware of this and they will likely take steps to correct them. Thank you so much for watching.